Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to our Friday edition. I hope all are doing well today. It's good to see you once again. As we're starting out today, just a couple of announcements, and then we will forge ahead. First of all, thank you for your good work with Exam 1. They are currently being processed, and sometime next week, I'll give you an update about when you may be able to expect to see them again. Your MAP test, we're still working on those, so I'd hope to have them done by today, but we got slowed down a little bit by sickness of the non-COVID variety, so nothing apocalyptic, but it slowed us down a little bit. I will try to update you sometime early next week about when you can expect to see those. Hopefully they'll be done soon, and I'll pass them back to you when they're finished, as well as record the grades, and you'll be welcome to ask any questions at that time about your MAP test. So those two are processing. I'll update you as soon as they're ready for you to peruse. And as far as things to come, your next major assignment is going to come in about 2 weeks when your Burke-Payne primary source paper will be due. That paper will be due on the 12th, and it'll be due at 5 o'clock, submissible through Canvas. And on that day, I actually give you an open day on the days when I have papers due. I usually don't have regular class session, just in case someone does need to put the finishing touches on in the afternoon before. So that day you'll have the class time to work on it, as well as, of course, the time before that as well. So that'll be coming up in about 2 weeks. Certainly, if you haven't started reading the Burke-Payne books, this would be a good time to start working on that. I'll send out again this weekend the page parameters in case you missed that, although you should be able to find the email for that as well if you search for it. I sent that out earlier this semester. Also, you will see the second section of the course on Canvas starting to take shape a little more now that we've gotten closer to it. And one of the things you'll see already there, and it'll be growing over the course of the weekend and early next week, is a module dedicated to the Burke-Payne papers. That'll contain some helpful materials for you. For instance, biographical videos on the two personalities, if you would like to know a little bit more about their background to inform your reading of their works, and some tips on ways to, take some shortcuts to analyze some of their ideas in a little bit more depth. So those will be appearing for you on Canvas as well over the weekend and early next week. There's already one video that I posted there on Thomas Paine that I did a while back. So that's there if you want some extra biographical information about him and some insights on what he's talking about in his work. And certainly I'll be glad to answer any questions or queries you've got as we go forward as well. Next week, we'll start watching Amazing Grace on Monday and on Wednesday. And that will both give you an opportunity to engage with one of the more compelling stories about people attempting to deal with the issue of the slave trade, something we'll talk about a little bit today as well. It also is going to be a week where you don't have additional reading assignments. That is, of course, by design. That's to open things up a little bit for you to take some time to do the Burke-Payne readings or get a little bit further along with your Burke-Payne readings. So take advantage of that time as well. I am going to be gone next Friday. This is not by design. In fact, when I was going to be gone, when we were actually out a few Fridays ago, that's when I was supposed to be gone for what I'm going to be gone for next week. But they canceled what I was going to be gone for then. But I didn't want to then say, well, hey, they canceled my thing, so we'll go ahead and have class because, well, I'm too much of a softie that way. So I didn't do that. But now I have to actually be gone for the thing that I was going to be gone for then. So long story short, we'll watch the film on Monday and on Wednesday. And I'm actually going to give you another open day on Friday because with COVID being like it is, it's hard to get somebody who's able to come in and show the video for the class. Everybody's kind of stretched and they're not really wanting people to bounce around between classes. So you're actually going to have 2 Fridays that are open. Take advantage of them. You'll have next Friday open as well. And then we'll finish the movie on Monday. That Wednesday, we'll talk about the American Revolution. And then that Friday of the 12th is when your paper will be due. So you'll have another open day next Friday. I'll remind you of this as next week gets started. Take advantage of it. Get to work on that assignment so it doesn't crowd in on you at the last minute. So any questions you've got as we're starting out today about any of these things, or of course anything else as well? Any questions, comments, clever and insightful quips, hot takes, and news flashes. No news day. That's the way you want it on a Friday. It's time just to be done on Friday, and we'll be there shortly. All right, well, thank you. And I appreciate your patience with the shifting dates. I know that it destroys your world to miss any time in class. So we will avoid that as much as possible for the rest of the semester. But hold fast. And remember, if you're having withdrawal symptoms, just a phone call away. So just, or email away. So I'll be glad to help you with whatever withdrawals you may be suffering. Well, ladies and gents, we are moving into the second phase of this course. We've had exam one, and that first section has been very heavily involved in matters of the Reformation, the religious debates that were going on during the early modern period. And that really is not a Dordt thing. I mean, you kind of look at it and you think, well, yeah, that's what we do here at Dordt. We talk about spiritual things. But really, that would be the case no matter where we were at, because these debates influence every facet of society. And they really do lend to the transforming of not only the European worldview, but it ends up impacting other people as well, because as we're seeing, Europeans are branching out to all parts of the world at this point. And what's happening right now is a really fascinating turn in Western and world histories, because before the early modern period, despite what we may think from our sort of Westocentric perspective, Europeans were really not the top dogs around the world. During the medieval period, they had a lot of competition, including the Arabic empires of the Middle East, the Byzantine empires of the East, are a little bit closer to the Western European homeland. And then across to the Far East, you had massive empires in China and India, many of which were actually more advanced technologically and in terms of their infrastructure than many of the European powers were. In 140, we talked about the Mongol Empire. It was immense and wielded powerful influence, and in many ways was superior in strength and in numbers and in technology to a lot of the European world. And so it is interesting and astonishing what happens during the early modern period when Europe begins to branch out and explore distant parts of the world, and then slowly but surely begins to supplant and surpass, especially those far eastern powers. So that eventually Europe is pretty much in the driver's seat in the late 18th and 19th centuries. We get to the age of imperialism by dint of their sort of sheer force of will on the one hand and their mastery of industrial technologies. European societies have pretty much supplanted the other great empires of the world. Something else that aids this is the fact that there's a lot of internal strife in those empires. Some of them are very old, and especially in China and India, you're going to have civil wars that occur. And those civil wars will weaken some of those long-standing empires and make them easier prey for European powers once they come in. So you're seeing a pretty significant shift in sort of the balance of power around the world that we're going to be continuing to follow over the next few weeks, especially in this course. And it will have very important consequences for not only the second phase, but the final phase of the course as well. In the case of what was called at that time the New World, the Americas, Europeans already had a bit of an advantage, the same sort of advantage that later on they're going to enjoy around the world. In regard to the Americas, they already had superior technology, and they had an ability to sort of influence things to a greater degree because a lot of the societies they were encountering were unprepared for the strategies they adopted. And also, a lot of those societies were weakened by disease. When you talk about the Columbian Exchange, the things that were exchanged when Europeans came to the Americas, one of the foremost things they exchanged were biological agents. And those biological agents wiped out massive numbers of the native populations of the New World. We will never know exactly how many people occupied these lands when Europeans first landed. And part of the reason for that is because many people on the coast contracted European diseases. They carried them inland, And many of those inland populations died out before they ever saw the first European. So millions of people in the Americas when Europeans arrived, and thousands of them end up dying due to disease. And then you add to that mistreatment when they did encounter European peoples, and you just got a very sad, tragic scenario unfolding. One thing these early European settlers tried to do was to harness the native populations for labor. But they ended up running into some roadblocks. And the first one of those was the issue of disease that I just mentioned. When you enslaved or employed, they would use the word employed, but it was closer to a form of slavery, native peoples to serve the needs of the Europeans, especially the Spanish and Portuguese that were arriving. One problem they had was they died off very quickly. They contracted European diseases. They didn't have immunities. It's going to take a while for them to develop those immunities. And so native slaves would die very early sometimes. The other problem is if you have native peoples as slaves on like a Spanish encomienda, they have some advantages that enable them to escape your captivity, the captivity that you've imposed on them. Just sort of imagine with me for a few moments. Imagine you are a native of this area and somebody comes into this area and enslaves the population of Sioux County and forces you to work for them. Now, if you were to set your mind towards trying to escape, what advantages would you enjoy as a Sioux County native that those who are your captors would not enjoy? What are some advantages you might have if you were setting your mind towards trying to escape? You know the land so much better than they do. You know every contour of it, every hill, every furrow. They don't. They're new to this area. So if you can escape, you know much better the places to hide and how to navigate and how to survive than they do. Excellent. Other advantages you would enjoy as a native that they might not. Yeah, you can not only go places that they can't go, but you can harness the land and its riches in ways they can only dream of. And here's something that is a particular advantage to someone who's a native as well. Um, I'm not a short guy by any stretch. I consider myself about average height. But nobody's ever going to mistake me for a dyed-in-the-wool Dutchman. And why is that? And this is without me talking. Once I talk, they'll know for sure. What is the kind of stereotype about Dutch people as regard to height? I've heard that they're kind of tall. I've heard that's a good thing when you're talking basketball. It really works out well. That may be a bit of a stereotype. Not all Dutch folk are tall, but that's kind of the stereotype that among the Dutch, generally, they have pretty good stature. It's all the good food in the Low Countries. It leads to some great genes in that regard. So what is something that, me as a Southerner, someone who doesn't have quite that physical characteristic, what's something I can't do that somebody who is native to the area might be able to do? What's that? Yes. That person who is a native of here, by the way they dress, by their appearance, it might be much easier for them to blend in with the crowds than it is for me to. Now, that's kind of superficial. I probably, I could pull it off. I could take it, for a little while. We went to Chick-fil-A in Sioux City and we're ordering behind the counter and I'm just talking and not thinking, I'm just in my head, I'm about to get chicken. I mean, that's all I'm thinking about. And the guy behind the counter says, "So where are you from?" And I'm not thinking, I said, "Sioux Center." And he's like, "No, you're not." And then I thought, "Oh, he wants to know where I'm originally from." And then I'm like, "Oh, I'm from Louisiana." And he's like, "Yeah, that makes sense." But in my mind, I'm focusing on chicken, waffle fries. I mean, that's where my mind was at, important places. So, but I have to talk for people to recognize that difference. In the New World, native peoples, they can disappear and they can blend in as well. I mean, you go to a tribe and you say, "Hey, 5 of these people were working at our encomienda down the hill. And now here they are amongst you. And the local chieftain looks around and says, all I see are, my people. Can you prove these people are your people who are working there? It's very easy for them to sort of melt away and blend in. So you put all these things together, and they were having a hard time maintaining a labor force of native peoples, despite some of the heavy-handed attempts we see with people like the Aztecs and the Incas to coerce them and to dominate them. They were very successful at that, but they had problems maintaining a labor force that was dependable. And so, infamously so, where do they start to look for additional labor? Africa. You wouldn't think it at first glance, but Africa has got advantages in terms of a market for free labor that overcome some of the issues they're having with native labor in the Americas. For instance, Africa has been interconnected with Asia and Europe throughout this entire period. And so biological agents are not as much of a threat to African labor because they're not as susceptible to European diseases. And once you get to the New World, what is the problem that a native of Africa is going to have if they are setting their minds towards escape? What are the challenges they're going to face? Think about the advantages native peoples had. No, this is a completely new place to them. They don't know the land. They don't know how to survive on it. They don't know where to go. Yeah. What are other disadvantages they will have? They can't blend in. I mean, yeah, their skin color is darker than native peoples and certainly darker than Europeans. They're easily identifiable if they escape. So when you create a system where the enslaved are completely made up of Africans, then at least until later, when you have some freed Africans in the Americas, you assume if somebody's of African descent, they're a slave. And slave traders take them back into captivity if they escape. And so you have those disadvantages as well. There's always been slavery in the human experience of different kinds. You've had slavery and captivity because of warfare, or you've had debt slavery, which is a big thing in like the New Testament world. You see Paul talking about that several times. There are people who have become indebted because they owe somebody something and they're working to pay it off. So it's always existed in different forms. What we see developing about this time, though, is a little bit different in the sense that it is primarily directed towards a particular people, a particular ethnic group, or people from a particular origin. And it's hard to know which came first, the economic incentives to develop a slave system or the racism that eventually accompanied it. Historians are debating endlessly which came first. Is there some degree in which Europeans viewed African peoples as inferior in some way already, and thereby they could be enslaved? Or does racism, this idea that in some way Africans are inferior, have to be developed as a philosophy in order to justify the economic system of slavery? That's one of the big debates going on amongst historians now, because you do definitely see an increase, a market increase in those philosophies that try to view African peoples as inferior because of their culture, because of the fact that they don't live in the same ways as Europeans during this period. Now, to be fair, many Europeans had the same attitude towards Native Americans. And so that's what leads some to say, well, these prejudices were already there, they were already inherent, and then the economic incentives came along as well. And we may never be able to answer those questions, just like the chicken and the egg, which came first. When God set the first chicken on the earth, is that the answer to the question, or is it more complicated than that? In the same way, which comes first, the economic incentive or the racism that comes along with it? It's hard to know. We may never know for sure, be able to split that in a way that's satisfactory. What we do know is this system begins in the 16th century. It is accompanied by default assumptions that in some way these peoples are inferior and therefore this is okay. And in fact, you're hearing some of the same things, like I said, directed towards native peoples. In fact, they have a conference in Spain amongst Catholic leaders to debate the question of whether Native peoples have a soul or not, and whether they should be objects for conversion. I think we talked about this a few weeks ago. We talked about the Catholic missions to the West and the Far East. So, yeah, there's a lot of this talk going on about many peoples around the world, and certainly it's being applied to these Africans who were brought over as slaves. They first began arriving in South America and Central America. Central America is the place where the biggest sugar plantations are. And so there and in Brazil are where you're going to find the highest numbers of these African peoples that are brought over. Over time, the system that develops comes to be referred to as the triangular trade. Because as you can see here in this graphic, these traders will start out in Europe and they'll sail down to the western coast of Africa. They'll acquire slaves on the coast, often from African chieftains who have acquired captives in warfare, and then they'll sail over to the Caribbean or to South America, and they will unload these slaves and sell them. They will acquire goods in the New World in exchange for those slaves, and then they'll take those goods they acquired in the New World and they'll carry them back to Europe, thus completing the triangle. And they'll sell the goods they acquired for slaves in Europe, making a profit, usually a pretty handsome profit. So this ends up becoming the default system of trade and commerce throughout the Atlantic world from the early 16th century, stretching through the early 19th century as well. To give you a nice visual graphic to help you sort of comprehend the numbers here, here's a breakdown of where slaves were going circa the 18th century or so. This is about the midpoint of the 18th century. And as you can see, just as I said, the bulk of them are coming to places in Central and South America. But increasingly, you'll have them coming to what will be the United States as well. Famously or infamously, the first slaves arrived in the U.S. in the year 1619. They'll arrive at Jamestown, which of course is the first English colony in the New World. And from that point, slavery will be a very present thing in American cultures as well, pretty much from that point forward, especially in the Southeast and increasingly in the American South, because that area is an area that's ripe for sugar growing, rice growing, for creating the very kinds of plantations where slave labor is very profitable. Soon, you'll see some slaves present as servants in the middle colonies and the New England colonies as well. So it is pervasive throughout the American colonies, though it is concentrated more so in those southern states. In the case of Great Britain, we're going to see next week how a group of crusaders basically brings about the end of the slave trade there in 1807. They're led by people like William Wilberforce, who is the star of this particular film, and a number of others, Hannah More, Samuel Clapham, William Clarkson, who are leaders in the abolitionist movement in the British Isles. They'll end the trade in 1807, and then slavery itself will be declared illegal in 1833. For us, of course, the end of slavery is going to be a much more apocalyptic sort of event. In American culture, we're going to end up fighting a very bloody and devastating civil war from 1861 to 1865 before slavery is ended in the United States. And ironically, this goes to show how history can be very ironic and take strange turns. One of the ironies of the end of the slave trade in Great Britain that we're going to see in the film we're going to watch is that it made slavery in the American South more profitable, thereby extending slavery here probably longer than it might otherwise have existed. We become a major cotton supplier for the British Isles, and they get that from India and they get it from us, and they end up paying more into the Southern economy and thereby cementing the presence of slavery here, probably even a little bit longer than it might have lasted otherwise. So interesting ironies, very cruel ironies in a lot of ways. Questions that you've got, any comments that you've got about this history, any questions that have been raised, and we'll certainly talk more as we go forward, but in your mind over the last few years or whatever you'd like to ask. Questions and or comments? Thoughts? It's become very contested ground in many ways, as is all of history. There's one point where, we'd say history was always a controversial subject to study, but it seems like it's never been more controversial than it has been today. And especially some of these more painful episodes in our history, people do still struggle to talk about well. So feel free to ask any questions you have got at any point about any of it. And certainly don't hesitate to share your thoughts and feelings about all of it as well. I think you have to toe the line between being accurate. Even when you're trying to promote a good cause, you need to be fair and accurate in what you're presenting. On the other hand, we very much have to avoid the tendency of exploring those parts of our histories that make us uncomfortable. Those, in some ways, are the ones we've got to explore the most because they often have the most to teach us. We'll have more to say about all this, and we'll look a little bit more at how this connects to what we're about to talk about as we're finishing up Amazing Grace in a couple of weeks. But for now, I want to pivot a little bit. And you may be thinking, okay, well, now how do these pivots connect with what we were just talking about? Well, they actually do quite significantly, and I hope you'll see that as we go forward. Because at the same time, this system of enslavement was developing in Europe, they're also developing some philosophical notions and they end up challenging the very basis of it. They don't know it yet, but they are starting to develop those very questions and ideas that are going to ultimately strike at the heart of practices like this. To start with, let's talk about the very early scientific revolutions that began what we often hear referred to as, or what's often referred to as the Enlightenment. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because most of this you already know. Most of these people you already know. This early Enlightenment period is a period in which the issue of cosmology really becomes front and center. And that issue of cosmology, what our place in the universe is, goes a long way towards setting the framework for all the debates and conversations that are going to follow. Now, we talk about cosmology, we're talking about the question of what the Earth's relationship is to the other heavenly bodies that we observe in the sky. Can anyone tell me, without me changing the slide, who the person was that first advanced the theory that in fact we revolve around the sun? Yes, Nicholas Copernicus. Like I said, this is stuff you already know. Now, does this guy not look like a young Keanu Reeves? If you don't see it already, you will never be able to not see it again after this point. Keanu Reeves has got the greatest surfer dude accent ever. It's hilarious. The first time I saw him in something serious was in Paula Abdul's music video to her song Rush. Before that, the only place I had ever seen him was on Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. And in Rush, he is like the romantic lead. And the video starts playing, and I'm watching it. I'm like, is that Ted? And it was. And at that point, I'm like, wow, they got him like playing the Uber stud in this romantic video. Who could have imagined then that he would actually end up being an action star? Wow. No way. Way. He does eventually become an action star as well. In films like Point Break, where he famously said, I am an FBI agent. See, that accent never leaves your mind once you hear it. And he was in Sweet November. My wife conned me into going to see Sweet November. Gentlemen, let me just tell you, if there's a romantic film that has got a month in the title, then get extra popcorn because somebody's going to die. I don't know who, but somebody will die and it will be really sad. So get your popcorn and, turn your head to the side a little bit, let that one man tear slide down and drop in your popcorn. It's okay. In Sweet November, he's like this vicious ad executive and he's trying to pitch a campaign for selling hot dogs, advertising hot dogs. He's like, you're sitting by the beach. And what do you want? You want a hot dog. It's a hot dog. A hot dog. So thank Keanu Reeves and thank Nicholas Copernicus. I dare you to ever forget the man's name now. Nicholas Copernicus wrote The Revolution of the Heavenly Spheres. It was a posthumous work because he wanted to be dead when it came out, because he feared that he would be dead when it came out if he wasn't dead already. So it was a posthumous work released 1543, and it argued for a heliocentric universe, a universe in which the earth and other heavenly bodies revolve around the sun. Now, at that point, about all they could process was that basic idea. It would have completely blown their minds to hear someone then say, actually, this is one set of planets that revolves around one sun that is one subset of a much vaster universe. That was beyond their comprehension at that point, or at least beyond the comprehension of most. This is a very controversial thing in the 16th century. And over the next few years, other people are going to refine it. Like I said, I'm going to just sort of go through the Hall of Fame because these people's names you have heard before. Johannes Kepler in Germany makes further observations with his telescope and sees that these heavenly bodies are in motion. Galileo Galilei ends up getting himself in trouble with the Catholic Church when he makes observations about the moons of Jupiter, and he confirms what Copernicus has already said, that in fact he believes we are in motion around the sun. He, in fact, is called in the Catholic Church to sort of recant what he said, and he does that, but he has his fingers crossed when he's doing it, and under his breath says, yeah, but it does revolve. We do revolve around the sun. The sun is at the center, not us. This guy is the guy who is famous for establishing the rationale behind how all this works. For a long time, there are people who accepted the notion finally that the planetary bodies are in motion around the sun. What they didn't know, though, was how. And it's this guy, Sir Isaac Newton, who makes the critical connection between what we now know as gravitation or magnetism and the position of the planets in the universe relative to one another. He is famous for his Mathematica Principia, or Mathematical Principles of Natural Philosophy, in which he argues that magnetism is the key for how the heavenly bodies relate to one another. I don't know if you had the same experience I did growing up, where somebody gets a magnet and they bring it on the school bus and they have fun kind of playing with the magnet and astonishing everyone, because we're easily astonished in junior high. And they sit there and, if you put the magnets close together, they've got this kind of repelling force as they get close. There's something that pushes back. But then if you get them close enough, what do? They snap together. So you've got that weird distinction, that sort of conjunction of one, both the repellent magnetism, but then if they get close enough, an attractive magnetism as well. I'm sure there are dating metaphors that we could create from that, but we won't do that because, for some, the pain may be too fresh. Valentine's Day is not too far away. So, but that idea of an attractive magnetism and a repellent magnetism. This dude theorizes that essentially that's what binds the universe together. You thought it was the force. No, everyone. It is not the force that binds the universe together. It's magnetism, or at least in the case of the physical proximity of planets to one another, that's what it is. It keeps them in balance. It keeps them moving in certain directions and with regularity. Newton's going to formulate basic laws of motion, laws that you still talk about in your basic science classes today. You've talked about them in high school. You'll talk about them further in college. He was also one of the people who founded one of the first groups dedicated to scientific exploration in the Western world. This group is called the Royal Society, created in England, and he was one of the first leaders of that Royal Society. Got a nice little reminder there on the PowerPoint slide. Gravity, it's not just a good idea, it's the law. We do live in a somewhat postmodern age, and in that people are questioning the basic foundations of some realities in our world and in our universe. They're kind of saying, You know, not everything is as easy as you think it is. There's more below the surface. And to some degree, postmodern ideas have provided a very healthy correction to some forms of modernism and Enlightenment thought that said that reason is the be all end all of everything. Postmodern ideas have said, well, that's not true. You can't solve every problem with reason. So you do have to have some humility about that. There are some things that are beyond the five senses. And so, you know, you can appreciate that contribution. On the other hand, there is some degree to which postmodernism in some forms has kind of gone wild, to the point where some people are like, you just can't know anything if you can't know everything through the use of the five senses. And you have some philosophers that have gone so far as to wonder, are we even here? Are we living in some kind of simulation? Are we all just some kind of video game? Is Mario more real than we are? And you know, they get kind of tied up in knots trying to determine what is the basis of reality. And to that degree, this Enlightenment period sort of offers us some reassurance that though you can't know everything with your five senses, and you shouldn't presume that you can, there are some things that you definitely can know, and they just are what they are. You know, you can have flat Earth Society internet pages all you want, and maybe about 60 years ago, you might could have legitimately gotten away with that. We have been off the earth, we have photographed it, we have some documentary evidence that it is indeed round. You know, there are some things that are just, you know, kind of what they are. And gravitation's kind of one of those things. You know, there is a force that is active. We can't always describe the nature of it, but it definitely seems to exert that sort of operative influence that Newton was talking about. There was a great story a few years ago about the boxing champion Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali got on a plane and he was flying to an engagement on the East Coast, and the flight attendant is walking past him, and you get the announcement that they're about to land, and she looks over at him and says, "Sir, you need to fasten your seatbelt because everybody else had, but Muhammad Ali had." You know anything about Muhammad Ali, he was just sort of a dude that did his thing. And if you challenge that, then he always had a snappy response for you. And so his response to her was, "Honey, Superman don't need no seatbelt." And her response to him was, "Superman don't need no plane either. Fasten your seatbelt." And she kept going. It's at that one time was one moment when he was sort of like, hey, you know, I think I'll do this. Imagination is great. It's beautiful. I'd never want to kill it. But if you get on the top of this building and you say, I believe I can fly, and you jumped off, unless you are endowed with radioactive powers from a spider or, you know, something else, you're probably going to plummet because gravity, it just exists. It's just sort of there. It is what it is. So, you know, I mean, we live in a world today where people sort of act like there's nothing you can be anchored to. Well, people like Newton would still sort of rise to challenge that and say, you know, we shouldn't be too presumptuous about what we can know, but there are things we can know and, you know, verifiable ways to arrive at that. Questions or comments, thoughts you'd like to present? Anything you'd like to contribute? Questions, comments, thoughts? Now I'm going to jump ahead a little bit. And I'm going to jump ahead to get to the things that more directly connect with where we're going to be going in our next phase. So I don't mean to short cosmology, and we could actually talk forever. You can get really complicated with all this. You can get to the 20th century, talk about the uncertainty principle and all that, and how it connects Isaac Newton, or excuse me, Albert Einstein, theory of relativity, and all that. It gets interesting, and that's going to be a feast for the mind in your science classes if you haven't done that already. But I want to move towards some of the implications of this for the social order, because a lot of what we deal with here in this class entails how societies interact, how people interact in societies and in communities and in groups. Just as scientific thinking and the application of reason is impacting cosmology and what we would call the physical sciences, the fruits of that are starting to be applied to other areas as well, to social order. And this is where things get kind of interesting and sometimes controversial, to say the least. Not that the physical sciences weren't loaded with their controversies as well. But when you're applying reason to the human condition, you're dealing with a lot of complicating factors, and some interesting theories begin to emerge and interesting debates start to ensue. Just to refer back to some things we've already mentioned, in the late 17th century, you get people starting to advance formal political theories, a lot of them based on scientific concepts. The idea is if we can use reason to arrive at rock solid principles, or at least tentative principles for how the universe operates, then might we not do the same thing in the realms of philosophy and what today we might call political science, the theory of how one organizes society. Some early people that took a stab at that would include people like the Elizabethan administrator Francis Bacon, who served in the early 17th century. Thomas Hobbes, who we already mentioned, remember us mentioning his work Leviathan, which was written during the Cromwellian period in England. And very importantly, somebody that we haven't talked about much, but who is very much worth mentioning, John Locke. Does anybody get the joke on the PowerPoint slide? You know where this bottom picture comes from? Yes, what's it come from? Yes, if you haven't watched Lost, it's a show worth checking out. It is a very interesting show about some people stranded on an island. It gets more complicated than that as it goes forward, but it's got a definite philosophical underpinning. Like the writers and directors, they're big fans of the study of philosophy, so they embed a lot of that in there. This character was named John Locke. They name a lot of the characters after famous philosophers. And this guy was actually named John Locke on the show. The real John Locke lived in the late 17th century in England, and he is the primary political theorist of the Glorious Revolution. His thought is what informs many of the changes that occurred that produced the constitutional monarchy in England that we talked about. Among the many writings he is famous for are works such as the Two Treatises of Government, published in 1689 in England, and A Letter Concerning Toleration. This is religious toleration that he's arguing for. He's basically arguing for that concept that we talk about, which becomes enshrined in England, where you have the official state church, but you have legal standing for dissenting groups as well. Locke's treatise on civil government, his two treatises on civil government, are in some ways the working out of that idea that we talked about back when we discussed the execution of Charles I. What was the accusation leveled against Charles I? Treason. What does it mean if he can commit treason against the state? He is not the state himself. He is not above the law. He is not above the state. In some way, he also is subject to the state. You see a formal outworking of this idea in the work that John Locke does, arguing that governments are a contract of sorts between the people and those who govern, that they together have agreed on a certain body politic that holds things together and that is structured to serve the needs of the people, not the needs of the ruling classes. This is a big step forward in regard to theories about how political systems operate. Locke says specifically that, in his opinion, governments are constituted in order to protect people's life, liberty, and property. Governments are constituted for the purpose of protecting people's life, liberty, and property. And that is government's job. It is to serve the interests of the people, not just the interests of its own propagation or self-perpetuation. It is to serve the interest of the people. Where else have you heard a phrase somewhat similar to that? Yes, sir.
Liberty and the
Yes. And where does that spring from? With a great bass line in the background. You're not wrong. At least not one source. Yeah, and I don't mean to put you on the spot, but which of our documents does it come from? It's the earlier one. If you need a hint. Declaration of Independence. One of the biggest fans of John Locke in colonial America was Thomas Jefferson. He loved the readings of John Locke, writings of John Locke. He had annotated volumes in his library. We know that because his library became the foundation for the collection at the Library of Congress. So we've got Jefferson's copies of Locke, and they're heavily marked up. Jefferson was the young attorney charged with drafting the Declaration of Independence. He was part of a committee, but they gave him the job of creating the original draft. And when it came time to think about how government should be portrayed in the document, he toyed with this phrase from Locke. He liked it a lot. But if you know anything about Jefferson, he was sort of a champion of the common man. He had this sort of ideal that the backbone of society was the farmer working their land, the yeoman, the person who's at the bottom, giving strength to what goes on at the top. So when he incorporated it in the Declaration, he changed it to pursuit of happiness because he's afraid if he kept property, that might be some kind of window into the creation of an American aristocracy. And he didn't want that, so he included life, liberty, then he changed it to and the pursuit of happiness as a way to sort of envision all people being supported by the government in that way. Locke is so respected by those who engineered the Glorious Revolution that actually he's in exile when the Glorious Revolution happens. And when he returns to England after having been exiled during the time of the Stuart kings, he rides back in the same carriage as Queen Mary as she is on her way to be crowned alongside her husband as Queen of England. They're going to be crowned as co-rulers of England. So that's the standing that John Locke had with the leaders of the Glorious Revolution. This tradition that was enshrined in England during the Glorious Revolution is going to have tremendous impact in regard to providing the foundations of what's to come. We talk about the age of revolutions and the creation of the early American Republic. That's a story that we will save for our next time gathering together. Actually, we'll start the film next time we gather together as well. Have a good weekend. Let me know if there's anything I can help you with. Look forward to seeing you soon. You have a good weekend. Thank you. I'm going to try that was fun, but stay here, don't travel. Yeah, this is the time. Who's got it? So yeah, a lot of that, almost every class, you know, you have certain natural points in the semester where you offer things. This is why we get all the prestige and the big bucks, so can't complain. Have a good one.